You're listening to the Retire Coast podcast, where money, business, and lifestyle come together. Join us each week as we explore smarter financial planning, starting and growing businesses, and building the life you want at every stage, from millennials and Gen X to today's retirees.
Thank you for coming back to Retire Coast. Our topic today is going to be who we were in 1776. Now, this is another one of our podcasts, and it's part of our retirecoast.com series on the 250th anniversary, which takes place July 4th, 2026. This is another one of those times when the information that we're passing along is something completely unknown to the average person. I think the things that I'm finding in doing my research to write these articles for which the podcast is designed, I'm finding things I never knew before, and I am a history buff and learned it in both high school and college, and yet here we are with all kinds of things we didn't know about what happened in 1776 or that time period with the people who were the ones that created the United States of America. My relatives are part of that. I was fortunate enough to have relatives that moved into the United States in the early 1700s. But this particular topic today is about who the people were. Where did they come from? What language did they speak? What religion did they practice? What did they do for a living? All of these things, nothing is ever covered like this in movies or documentaries that I have seen, and yet we've covered a great deal. So you're going to be listening to a dialogue here that is absolutely fascinating, in my opinion, that's been created from the article that I wrote. And you're going to find out the average age of the people that were living at that time, which will blow you away. So please listen, and when you're finished, please make some comments in the show notes or go to retirecoast.com and read our full article on this topic. Thanks for coming to our podcast.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today is February 12th, 2026. And if you've been glancing at the calendar lately, you might have noticed a rather large, imposing date circling right towards us like a comet.
It's hard to miss, isn't it?
It really is. We are rapidly approaching the 250th birthday of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 2026.
2.5 centuries. It is a massive milestone. It's the kind of anniversary that it almost forces a pause.
Yeah.
You know, you have to stop and look backward before you can really understand how to move forward.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. We are digging into the USA 250th Anniversary Series from retirecoast.com, specifically an article titled Who We Were in 1776.
Right.
But I want to be really clear right off the bat. This isn't a history lesson about generals or, battle maps and troop movements.
No, and that's what makes this particular analysis so compelling. The core mission here is to ignore the famous names. We aren't talking about Jefferson, Washington, or Adams today. We are trying to answer a much more fundamental demographic question. Who were the actual everyday people living in the 13 colonies in 1776?
It's a total shift in perspective. We usually look at the stage. Today we are looking at the audience. And the concept that really stuck with me from the reading is this idea of skin in the game.
It's a powerful framing mechanism, I think. It doesn't matter if your ancestors stepped off a boat in Philadelphia in 1714 or if you personally flew into JFK last Tuesday.
Yeah.
If you live in the United States today, you are inhabiting a structure, a political and social house, that was built by the specific risks, the sacrifices, and frankly, the behaviors of the people in 1776.
It transforms history from something you just study into something you inherit. But let's cut through the preamble. I want to start with this statistic that completely derailed my morning when I first read it. Mm-hmm. It shattered every single mental image I had of a colonist.
I have a feeling I know exactly which data point you're referring to. It tends to have that effect.
I think you do. So I want to ask you, the listener, to close your eyes for just a second. Conjure up the image of a colonist in 1776. You're probably seeing a guy who looks like Ben Franklin, right? Balding, spectacles, maybe a little gout. Sitting in a library reading a pamphlet by candlelight.
That's the oil painting version. That's the founding father archetype we're all taught in school. Stern, wise, probably in his 50s or 60s.
Exactly. But when we look at the actual demographic data, that image isn't just slightly off. It's statistically profoundly wrong.
It's practically inverted.
Okay, hit us with the number.
The median age of a person living in the American colonies on July 4, 1776 was roughly 16.
Wait. Say that again?
16.
1-6.
So if I'm walking down the street in Philadelphia or Boston in 1776, half the people I meet are kids.
Teenagers and children. Strictly speaking, the 13 colonies were a society of adolescents. If you compare that to today, the median age in the U.S. is roughly 38 or 39. We are a middle-aged country. Wow.
1776 was a high school cafeteria.
Honestly, that explains so much about the volatility of the era. I mean, just think about the psychology of a 16-year-old versus a 40-year-old.
It's a completely different biological reality. It's not just about perspective. A 40-year-old has a mortgage, back pain, a distinct fear of instability, and a very real sense of their own mortality.
Right. They have something to lose.
A lot to lose. A 16-year-old, they think they're immortal. They are biologically wired for risk-taking. Their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that says, hey, maybe this is a bad idea, isn't even fully developed yet.
So when we talk about the revolution, we usually frame it as this high-minded philosophical debate about taxation and representation. But was it actually just intergenerational angst? A bunch of angry young men with no property wanting to flip the table?
You absolutely cannot discount that energy. Sociologists have a term for this. They call it a youth bulge.
A youth bulge?
Yeah. In modern geopolitics, when you see a country where the median age drops below 20, you almost always see instability, radicalism, or revolution. It's a predictable pattern.
Why? What's the mechanism there?
You have a surplus of labor, a surplus of energy, and usually in the colonial context, not enough accessible land to go around for everyone in the established areas. The old guys have the good land near the coast.
So the revolution wasn't just about taxes. It was about a ceiling, a future that felt blocked off.
It was about a future that these young people couldn't access under the current British system. They had the energy to fight because they had their whole lives ahead of them and very little to lose in the immediate sense.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Was the average age 16 because everyone was just dying incredibly early? Like, was 30 considered ancient?
That is one of the most persistent myths in popular history.
Yeah.
It's a total misunderstanding of the data. We see a chart that says life expectancy at birth was 35 to 45, and we assume people were crumbling into dust at age 40.
Right, like you hit your mid-30s and just drop dead of old age. Logan's Run style.
Exactly. But that's not how the math works. That average is heavily skewed by infant and child mortality. The first 5 years of life were an absolute gauntlet.
A gauntlet.
Diseases we don't even think about today. Diphtheria, smallpox, scarlet fever, plus a lack of antibiotics, harsh winters. If you were a baby or a toddler, the odds were rough. A significant percentage didn't make it to their 5th birthday.
But if you made it through that gauntlet...
If you survived childhood and the teenage years, you had a very good chance of living into your 60s, 70s, or even 80s.
Okay, so the image of old age was still there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Founding fathers themselves are proof of this. Franklin lived to be 84, Jefferson to 83. John Adams made it all the way to 90. They weren't anomalies. They were just the ones who survived the early years.
So it wasn't a world of people dying young. It was a world of people being born extremely often.
That is the perfect way to put it. It was a population explosion. Birth rates were astronomical compared to today, or even compared to Europe at the time.
How high are we talking?
Families with 7, 8, or 10 children were the norm, not the exception. It was a demographic boom.
Which makes sense for an agrarian society, which I know we're going to get to. You need farm hands, and the cheapest way to get them is to raise them yourself.
Precisely. But just take a moment and imagine the kinetic energy of a society where the center of gravity is a teenager. It explains the mobs. It explains the riots, the willingness to march hundreds of miles and fight a war. It was a young, restless, and frankly, an impulsive nation.
Okay, so we've established that we are dealing with a nation of teenagers. The total population, you said, was about 2.5 million people.
Well, that's the estimate, yes.
Now let's talk about who they were, because again, the stereotype is British colonies, British people. End of story.
And to be fair, that's not entirely wrong. The English were the majority. About 60% or 3/5 of the white population was of English descent. These are people who either immigrated themselves or, more likely by 1776, were the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of earlier settlers.
Right. 60% is a clear majority. It explains why we are speaking English right now, not German or Dutch. The cultural and legal framework was English.
Without a doubt.
But 60% isn't 100%. What about the other 40%? That's a huge chunk of the population.
And this is where the story gets much more interesting and much more complex. The diversity of 1776 was far greater than people usually realize. It wasn't a monolith at all.
Let's break that down then, because the second largest group in the colonies isn't even European.
No, it is not. The second largest demographic group, making up approximately 20% of the total population, was enslaved Africans.
That is 1 in 5 people.
1 in every 5 people you would have met in 1776 was a person of African descent held in bondage. And while they were concentrated heavily in the southern colonies, we're talking Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, working on the tobacco and rice plantations.
They weren't only in the South.
Not at all. Their presence was felt everywhere. They were in the North. They were in the cities working as domestic servants or skilled laborers. They were brought by force, but they are a foundational pillar of the demographics, the economy, and the culture of 1776. You simply cannot tell the story of the colonies without that 20%.
Absolutely not. Okay, so we have 60% English, 20% enslaved Africans. That leaves another 20%. Who's in that final fifth?
This is the European melting pot starting to bubble. The next biggest group are the Scots-Irish and the Scottish, making up somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population.
And the Scots-Irish are a fascinating group. They weren't settling in the nice, established coastal cities like Boston or Charleston. Those areas were already taken or too expensive.
Right. The good real estate was gone.
Yeah.
So they went to the edge, the backcountry, the Appalachian frontier.
The danger zone.
That's a good way to put it. These are people who had often fled hardship or conflict in nearly every generation. They've been moved from Scotland to Northern Ireland and then to America. They were tough, they were clannish, and they were deeply, deeply suspicious of centralized government.
No matter who was in charge.
Whether that government was in London or later in Philadelphia, they were the buffer zone between the coastal elite and the Native American nations. They were constantly in conflict.
And right there with them on the frontier, you have the Germans.
Yes, about 6 to 10% of the population. They settled heavily in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Dutch are actually Deutsch or German.
Mm-hmm.
They're also pushing into the backcountry down the Shenandoah Valley. They were looking for land just like the Scots-Irish.
Plus you have smaller but still significant groups, the Irish Catholics.
About 5%, mostly urban laborers and rural poor, often faced a lot of prejudice.
The Dutch, still holding on in New York?
Absolutely. Concentrated in New York, which used to be New Amsterdam. You still had Dutch-speaking communities and powerful Dutch families.
And the French Huguenots, the Protestants who fled France.
A smaller group, maybe 1 or 2%, but influential. They settled in places like South Carolina, New York, and Virginia.
And we absolutely have to mention the people who were already here for generations, the indigenous population.
Right. Native Americans aren't counted in the colonial census in the same way, obviously, but they were a constant presence. They were deeply integrated into the trade networks, the diplomacy, and the conflicts of the time. They were the third geopolitical player in the room, alongside the colonists and the British.
So if you walk down a street in Philadelphia in 1776, it wasn't just a sea of English faces.
Not at all. And it wasn't just the faces, it was the sound. The auditory landscape of 1776 was incredibly noisy and diverse. It wasn't quiet.
That's a great point. We mentioned English was the dominant language. It was the language of law, commerce, sort of the operating system of the colonies.
It was the lingua franca. You needed it to do business on a large scale.
But the application layer, the day-to-day language people spoke at home, was multilingual.
Multilingual reality is the best way to describe it. In those German communities in Pennsylvania we just mentioned, English was a foreign language. The data in the source suggests that in many rural areas, native languages like German and Dutch survived for several generations.
So you could live your whole life in America without speaking much English.
If you were a German farmer in rural Pennsylvania in 1776, you might go your whole week market day, church on Sunday, family dinner, without speaking a single word of English. Your newspaper was in German, your Bible was in German, your almanac was in German.
That's wild to think about. We think of assimilation happening so fast today, partially because of mass media. But back then, you could stay in your linguistic bubble.
In rural areas, yes. It was a different story in the cities. Assimilation was faster. Money speaks every language. And if you wanted to be a successful merchant in New York or Philadelphia, you learned English, and you learned it fast.
And what about other European languages?
You'd hear Welsh, Scots Gaelic in the backcountry. You'd hear French. But there are other languages developing, too. The West African languages. This is a critical piece of cultural resilience. Enslaved people were often forced to adopt English for labor communication, understanding orders. But they retained linguistic traditions, structures, and words from their homelands. This wasn't just erased.
And it led to new languages being born.
Exactly. It led to the development of Creole dialects, like Gula in the coastal sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia.
Gula is fascinating because it's a synthesis, right? It's not just broken English.
No, it is a brand new language forged from the collision of English and various West African languages.
Yeah.
It was maintained because those communities were relatively isolated on the islands. It's a powerful testament to the fact that people don't just lose their culture. They adapt and preserve it, even under the most horrific conditions.
So audibly, 1776 was English, German, Dutch, French, Gaelic, Welsh, various Native American languages, and emerging Creole dialects. It was a true cacophony.
It completely challenges the idea of a monolith. And that diversity extends to religion as well, though with a very, very strong common thread that we need to unpack carefully.
Right. The numbers on this are stark. The source says over 98% of colonists adhere to some form of Protestant Christianity. That is a massive supermajority.
It is. It's an overwhelming number. But if you stop there, you miss the entire story. Because Protestant in 1776 didn't mean unified. Not even close.
It wasn't one big happy church family.
It was a cage match. You have to look at the geography to understand the fractures. Down south in Virginia, Georgia, the Carolinas, you have the Anglican Church.
The Church of England.
Exactly. This is the establishment. It is the official state-supported, tax-funded church.
Meaning, if I live in Virginia in 1776, I'm paying taxes to this church whether I like it or not.
Correct. And the ministers are effectively government employees. Their salaries are paid by the state. They preach order, hierarchy, and loyalty to the king. It's a very top-down structure. The king is the head of the church. It's a tool of social control.
Okay, now teleport me north to Boston, Massachusetts.
Totally different universe. Up there, it's the Congregationalists, the direct descendants of the Puritans. They fled England specifically to get away from the Anglican structure.
So their entire reason for being is opposition to the Southern model.
Precisely. Their whole structure is bottom up.
Yeah.
The local congregation hires the minister. They vote on his salary. They can fire him.
So if the minister starts preaching something that people don't like,
they fire him and get a new one. This makes the New England pulpit an incredibly radical political machine. In New England, the sermon was the news feed. It was the political rally. It was the op-ed page.
So when the British start tightening the screws in, say, 1774 with the Intolerable Acts, the Anglican minister in Virginia might preach, honor the king, be patient. But the Congregationalist in Boston says...
He says, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. You literally have a religious war brewing inside the political war. The northern churches became the ideological engine of the revolution.
And then you get to the middle colonies, Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The source calls them a testing ground for tolerance.
The middle colonies were the most pluralistic. You had the Quakers in Pennsylvania who were pacifists and, very importantly, early opponents of slavery. You had Presbyterians who were the Scots-Irish. You had Lutherans who were the Germans.
So it's more of a free-for-all.
It had to be. There was a higher degree of religious tolerance there, mostly out of necessity. There was so much diversity that no single group could dominate the others, so they had to learn to coexist.
And we have to mention the Great Awakening. I feel like this comes up in history class, but what does it actually mean for the guy in the field in 1776?
The Great Awakening was a huge religious revival movement that swept through the colonies a few decades before the Revolution. It saw the rise of more evangelical denominations, Baptists, Methodists.
And they operated differently.
Very differently. They spread via circuit riders, these charismatic traveling ministers on horseback who went out to the frontiers where there were no fancy established churches.
Taking religion to the people.
And making it personal and emotional. But crucially, it taught people to question established authority. The message was, you don't need a fancy bishop or a government-paid minister to have a relationship with God. If you can choose your own path to God, maybe you can choose your own path to government.
It primed the pump for the revolution. It was a psychological shift.
Exactly. It democratized religion, which made it easier to imagine democratizing politics.
Now, despite that 98% Protestant dominance, there were minority faiths. Small, but they were there.
Yes. Catholics, for instance, made up less than 2% of the population. They face significant legal restrictions and deep suspicion.
Why the suspicion?
It was largely because they were associated with Britain's great geopolitical rivals, France and Spain, which were both powerful Catholic empires. There was a fear that Catholics would be loyal to the Pope instead of their new country. Maryland was originally founded as a Catholic haven, but by 1776 it had shifted to Anglican dominance, and Catholics there faced restrictions too.
And there were Jewish communities as well.
Small, but culturally significant and very well established. There were communities in the big port cities, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Newport, Rhode Island. In fact, the Touro Synagogue in Newport was dedicated in 1763. It is the oldest synagogue building still standing in the U.S. today.
Wow.
So they were a visible and integrated part of urban life in a way that often gets overlooked.
And one thing the historical record brings up that is almost always totally overlooked is the presence of Islam.
Yes, this is a critical point. Historical records, including slave narratives and shipping manifests, confirm that among the hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, a significant number were Muslims from West Africa.
And they maintained their faith?
They maintained their faith practices, like prayer and dietary customs, in secret, despite the severe restrictions and forced conversions of slavery. It's a hidden history, but a confirmed one. It adds another layer to that religious landscape.
And of course, the indigenous beliefs, which were ancient and diverse.
Right. They persisted despite generations of missionary efforts. In some cases, indigenous beliefs blended with Christianity, creating new syncretic faiths. In others, they remained completely independent.
So we have this young population. It's diverse, but English-dominated, Protestant-dominated, but fracturing into a million pieces. Now let's talk about the daily grind. What did these 16-year-olds actually do all day?
They worked from sunup to sundown. The data on this is unequivocal. Over 90% of colonists worked in agriculture.
90%. So for every 10 people you met, 9 of them were farmers?
At least. Yeah. Almost everyone was a farmer. But farming looked very different depending on where you were standing.
How so?
In New England and on the Appalachian frontier, it was almost entirely subsistence farming.
Meaning, grow what you eat.
Exactly. You are not playing a cozy farming video game here. This is not Stardew Valley. You are growing corn and squash and raising a few pigs so your family doesn't starve to death in February.
So it's survival.
Pure survival. Maybe, if you have a good year, you have a little surplus to trade for salt or gunpowder or a metal pot. But it's primarily about feeding your own family from your own land.
Versus the South.
The South is a different economic planet. That's where you see the plantation economy built on those cash crops. Tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, rice and indigo in South Carolina and Georgia.
And this wasn't for local consumption?
Not at all. This was commercial farming on an industrial scale. And it was heavily, totally reliant on that enslaved labor force we mentioned. This wasn't just about feeding the family. This is about export and global trade. It was big, big business.
But even with 90% of the population farming, you needed tools, you needed barrels, you needed shoes. You couldn't just grow everything. Right.
And that's where the other 10% comes in, the skilled trades. And calling it the tech of 1776 is a great analogy from the source. It really captures the importance of these roles. It was a world built on the necessity of hand-built survival.
The list of trades mentioned is fascinating because it sounds like a fantasy RPG character sheet. Blacksmith, wheelwright, tanner, shoemaker. But there's one that keeps coming up that I feel we totally underestimate today. The cooper.
The barrel maker.
Yeah. I mean, today a barrel is a decoration you put in a hipster bar to make it look rustic. But in 1776...
In 1776, the cooper is the highest tech logistics engineer in the entire country. You have to understand, cardboard doesn't exist. Plastic doesn't exist. Ziploc bags don't exist. Sacks are porous. Crates are heavy and hard to seal.
So if you want to move anything...
If you want to move anything of value over any distance, flour, salted pork, gunpowder, tobacco, rum, whale oil, it goes in a barrel.
It was the shipping container of the 18th century.
But it's so much more than that. A modern shipping container just sits there. A barrel is an engineering marvel. It's round, so a single person can roll 300 pounds of goods down a dock. It's watertight, so your flour doesn't rot on a 6-week voyage to London. It's strong enough to be stacked in a ship's hold.
And the skill required. I watched a video on this once. You aren't just gluing wood together.
No. It's an art and a science. You are bending thick staves of white oak over fire. Yeah. You have to understand the geometry of the bilge, to distribute pressure perfectly. You have to bevel the edges just right to get a seal.
So a bad cooper.
A bad cooper isn't just an annoyance, it's a national security threat. If a cooper does a bad job, the barrel bursts in the ship's hold. The food rots and the crew starves. The rum leaks out. The gunpowder gets wet. The economy grinds to a halt.
So they were well respected and well paid.
Very well paid. It represents this era where tech was tactile. It was physical knowledge. You couldn't fake it. You either knew how to seal a cask or you didn't. There was no YouTube tutorial.
Same with the blacksmith, right? The center of every town.
Absolutely. The blacksmith was the anchor of the local economy. We think of them making swords and armor in movies, but mostly they made nails, hinges, horseshoes, and axe heads. They repaired tools.
And nails were like gold.
Nails were so valuable that if a house broke down or if a family was moving, they would often burn the house down themselves just to sift through the ashes and recover the hand-forged nails to reuse them.
That's how resource-constrained this economy was. You destroy the house to save the nails.
That's it. And then you have printers like Mary Catherine Goddard, who printed an early copy of the Declaration. They were the internet of the day. They spread the revolutionary ideas.
This leads us perfectly to the role of women in this economy, because if 90% of people were farming, women were right there in the middle of it.
Absolutely. And the historical record emphasizes this point over and over. Women's labor was mostly unpaid, but it was absolutely essential for the survival of the household. It was the invisible economy.
What does that entail? What's the daily routine?
It's everything that keeps the farm from collapsing. Household management, yes, but also large-scale food preservation.
Right.
Without canning, pickling, smoking, and salting, the family dies in the winter. They made the candles, because you can't just flip a switch when it gets dark. They made soap from lye and animal fat. They spun wool into thread, wove thread into cloth, and sewed cloth into clothing for the entire family.
So they were manufacturers, essentially.
They were running a small factory out of the home, and then there was childcare, tending the garden, raising chickens, milking cows. It was a relentless dawn-to-dusk job.
And there were exceptions where they stepped into the visible cash economy.
Yes. The source notes that this often happened out of necessity. Widows, for example, might take over their late husband's business, running taverns, shops, or printing presses. And midwives were the primary healthcare providers for childbirth, a critical and respected role.
But legally, their position was not great.
Legally, they were in a position of coverture. It's an Old English common law concept. It meant that a married woman's legal identity was covered by or subsumed into that of her husband. She couldn't own property in her own right, sign contracts, or sue in court.
Okay, so life is hard. You're working the land from sunrise to sunset. But what happens when things go wrong? We are so used to a world with safety nets, unemployment insurance, Social Security. FEMA shows up after a hurricane.
In 1776, none of that existed.
Zero. Not even a little bit.
Zero. There were no government handouts. There was no welfare state. There was no expectation of government assistance. The whole mindset was different. If you were poor, you didn't look for a government check because that wasn't even a concept.
So if you broke your leg and couldn't farm for 6 months, or a fire burned down your barn,
right,
what happened?
You relied on two things and two things only: your family and your neighbors.
Let's talk about the family economy.
Yes. This is why families were so large. Children were not just a blessing. They were an economic necessity. They were your workforce, and they were your insurance policy.
Your 401k.
Your 401k, your disability insurance, your Social Security, all rolled into one. If you get sick, your sons and daughters work the fields. If you get old and can't work, they take care of you. If you didn't have kids, you were in a very, very precarious position in your old age.
And the community aspect, the classic image of a barn raising. That wasn't just a quaint tradition, it was a survival mechanism.
It's the social safety net. It was your congregation, your neighbors. If a family's barn burned down, the whole community showed up to rebuild it. Not just because they were nice, but because they knew it could be their barn next week.
Mutual obligation.
It was a system of mutual obligation. If a widow was left destitute, the church community stepped in. But it was local, and it was personal. You knew the people helping you, and you knew you'd be expected to help them in return.
The reality of money is also interesting here, the barter system. We think of economies running on cash.
Cash, actual gold and silver coins, or even reliable paper money was incredibly scarce, especially on the frontier. You didn't run to the ATM. Most transactions were not made with currency.
So how did anything get done?
You traded. You bartered. A blacksmith might shoe a farmer's horse in exchange for a bushel of corn and half a pig. A healer or midwife might be paid in chickens or firewood.
It sounds chaotic.
It was an economy built on debt, credit, and trust within a very small community. Everyone kept a ledger, either written or in their head. John owes me 3 days of labor for helping with his harvest. I owe Sarah 2 pounds of wool for that barrel of cider. It was a complex web of relationships.
And for those who had absolutely nothing, no trade, no land, no money, no family.
For poor Europeans, the last resort was often indentured servitude. This is a concept that is hard for us to grasp today because it's so foreign.
Explain it.
Poor Europeans, mostly young men, would trade 4 to 7 years of their labor, basically signing away their freedom for a fixed period in exchange for passage to America.
So it's a contract. I will give you 7 years of my life now for a chance at a life later.
That's the calculation. It was a desperate bet on the future. You are betting that you will survive the dangerous ocean voyage, survive the years of hard, often brutal labor, and come out the other side with skills, freedom, and maybe a small parcel of land.
Yeah, and many didn't make it.
Many didn't. But thousands and thousands took that bet. It was the only way for them to get a foothold in the New World.
So we have this hardscrabble, self-reliant, incredibly young society, and then war breaks out. And the revolution wasn't just armies meeting on a field. It ripped through these communities.
It did. And we need to dispel the notion that everyone was a flag-waving patriot. The source material estimates that the population was roughly split into thirds. A third were active patriots, a third were active loyalists, and a third just wanted to be left alone.
It was a civil war.
A brutal civil war. Neighbors fought neighbors. Families were torn apart.
Let's talk about the groups caught in the middle. Native Americans, for instance.
They were really, as you said earlier, caught between a rock and a hard place, caught between two expanding European empires.
And they had to choose a side.
They had to try and weigh alliances. The article mentions Joseph Brant, Tyendinaja, a brilliant Mohawk leader. He had to make a cold, hard calculation. Who is the bigger threat to our land and our way of life?
And honestly, from their perspective, the colonists were the bigger threat to their land, right?
In most cases, yes. The British government had actually tried to stop colonial expansion west of the Appalachians with the Proclamation Line of 1763. They basically drew a line on the map and said to the colonists, stop taking native land.
And the colonists hated that.
They were furious. They saw it as the distant government in London preventing them from claiming their destiny. So if you're a Native American leader, the British might look like the lesser of two evils. They're the ones, at least on paper, trying to hold back the tide of settlers.
So fighting for the British was fighting for their own homeland.
For many nations, like the Mohawk, that was the strategic choice. They sided with the British to try and stop American expansion. Other nations tried to stay neutral, but it was nearly impossible. The war came to them regardless.
And what about African Americans, both enslaved and free?
For them, the war was a complicated, dangerous, and sometimes contradictory path to potential freedom. The historical record notes Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, as the first casualty of the Revolution at the Boston Massacre in 1770.
So they were there from the very beginning.
From the first shots. But during the war itself, it was all about strategy and survival.
What was the strategy?
It split in two directions. Thousands of black men, both free and enslaved, served in the Continental Army. They fought for the patriot cause, believing that the rhetoric of liberty and unalienable rights would apply to them after the war.
And the other direction.
Many, many others fled to the British side.
Whoa.
Because the British actively recruited them. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation. It promised freedom to any enslaved person owned by a patriot if they would escape and fight for the king.
That is a brutal, staggering irony. The British monarchy offering freedom to the slaves of the men fighting for liberty.
It highlights the profound hypocrisy at the heart of the era, but it also highlights the agency of enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't just passively waiting to be freed. They were active participants, making the choice that gave them the best shot at personal liberty. For thousands, that meant running to the British.
And then you have the loyalists, the people who just didn't want a revolution, the ones who lost.
About 15-20% of the population were active loyalists. And these weren't just as civil villains. Some were wealthy merchants whose entire livelihood depended on British trade. Some were recent immigrants. Some were just conservative people who feared chaos more than they disliked taxes.
And what happened to them?
When the war ended, many of them lost everything. Their property was confiscated. They were tarred and feathered. Tens of thousands fled, becoming refugees. They went to Canada, to Britain, to the Caribbean. It was a massive displacement of people.
So the war ends, independence is declared and won. But here's where it gets really interesting legally. We have this assumption that on July 4, 1776, everyone just magically became a U.S. citizen.
And that is completely 100% legally incorrect.
Let's unpack this legal gray area.
Yep.
Because it's fundamental.
Okay. Before July 4, 1776, everyone in the colonies, with the exception of enslaved people and Native Americans, was a British subject. You owed allegiance to the king. He was your sovereign. You were his subject.
That's a clear legal status.
Very clear. After the Declaration of Independence, that status was gone. But there was no United States citizenship to replace it. The concept didn't exist yet.
So what were they, if not British and not American?
They became citizens of their state. You were a citizen of Virginia, or a citizen of Massachusetts, or a citizen of Pennsylvania. Your primary allegiance was to your state.
And the United States.
The United States is a plural noun. The founding documents say the United States are, not the United States is. It was seen as a confederation of sovereign states, not one unified nation.
So the idea of a single U.S. citizen with a national identity
Was extremely undefined and wouldn't be fully codified until much, much later. Really, you can argue it wasn't fully settled until the 14th Amendment, after the Civil War in 1868.
That's almost a century later.
Right. In 1776, your country was your state.
But they had to do something to prove they weren't British subjects anymore, right? You couldn't just sit on the fence and see who won.
Exactly. And the mechanism for this was the loyalty oath. This is a fascinating and often forgotten part of the Revolution. In many states, you were required to explicitly sign an oath renouncing King George III and pledging allegiance to the state of, say, Pennsylvania.
And if you refused to sign.
If you refused, you faced serious consequences. You couldn't vote, you couldn't own property, you couldn't serve in the militia or hold any public office. In some places, you were socially ostracized, fined, or even run out of town.
So it wasn't just a feeling in your heart, it was a legal necessity. You had to put your name on a piece of paper that said, I am a traitor to the king.
A piece of paper that would get you hanged if the British won the war. It was a life or death decision.
And of course, we have to talk about who was excluded from this new emerging concept of citizenship, even at the state level.
The definition was from the very beginning exclusive. It was generally limited to free white males, and in most states, only those who owned a certain amount of property.
So women.
Not included. They were still under the law of coverture with no independent legal identity.
Enslaved people.
Legally considered property, so the concept was completely irrelevant to them.
And Native Americans.
They were considered members of their own sovereign nations, not citizens of the states. They were outsiders, foreigners on their own land.
And the Naturalization Act of 1790, one of the very first laws passed by the new country, basically wrote this exclusion into the legal code.
It did. The act specifically limited the process of naturalization, of becoming a citizen after immigration, to free white persons. It wrote the racial exclusion right into the DNA of the American legal system from the very start.
So, as we look back from 2026, 250 years later, what we see is a picture that is both incredibly inspiring and deeply, deeply complicated.
It is. If we try to synthesize all this, to build a portrait of the average 1776 American, what do we get?
It's not Ben Franklin.
It's not Ben Franklin. It's a teenager, likely a farmer, living a life of hard physical labor. Deeply religious, but in a rapidly changing and fracturing religious landscape. Incredibly self-reliant, living in a barter economy where your neighbors were your only safety net. And they were navigating a dangerous political transition where signing a piece of paper could get you hanged.
And yet they laid the groundwork. They put these ideas on paper.
They did. And the evolution of that phrase, unalienable rights, is the key legacy. The craze started with an extremely narrow application. Basically, it applied to those property-owning white men we just discussed.
But the words themselves were powerful.
The words were revolutionary. They provided the language. They provided the moral and philosophical code that future generations, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, the suffragettes, the leaders of the civil rights movement, could use to expand and unlock freedom for everyone else.
So they built the house, even if they didn't open all the doors yet.
Exactly. You could say they created the rhetorical mechanism for their own obsolescence. They wrote a check that future generations would demand be cashed.
I want to end with a provocative thought from the source material. It's a line that really stood out. It mentions that independence wasn't just freedom from Britain and all its taxes and rules. It was freedom to build something new with one's own hands.
That's the self-sufficient spirit we talked about.
Yeah.
The cooper making the perfect barrel. The farmer clearing a new field from the forest. The family raising the barn together. It's an active freedom, not a passive one.
So here's the question for you, the listener, as you think about this upcoming 250th anniversary. We live in a world of modern safety nets, digital economies, and instant delivery. If I need a barrel, I click a button on Amazon. If I need food, I go to a superstore with food from all over the world. We are in many ways the opposite of self-sufficient.
Right.
Do we still possess that spirit, that self-sufficient spirit that was absolutely required not just to launch a revolution, but just to survive the year 1776?
It's a haunting question, isn't it? If the Wi-Fi went out tomorrow and the supply chains broke, could we build something new with our own hands?
Or have we become too comfortable, too specialized?
Comfort is the enemy of revolution. But maybe that spirit is still there just dormant, waiting for a reason to wake up.
Definitely something to mull over as we approach the big 250. We want to remind you to check out the full USA 250th Anniversary Series on retirecoast.com. There is so much more there to explore.
It's a phenomenal resource for understanding where we came from, which is the only way to figure out where we're going.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
I sincerely hope that you enjoyed listening to this. Please return to retirecoast.com and read the entire article. There are lots of things in that article you'll find fascinating. There's some infographics, there's a quiz, there's FAQs, lots of other things in there as well, and that I think you'll find more in depth about this topic. Plus, we have written a number of other articles, and we have several other podcasts that I think you'll also find interesting on the 250th anniversary. That includes Behind the Scenes of 1776. These are camp followers, the backbone of the American Revolution. I particularly like that one. It talks about the women and the children of the war and how they contributed. And then we have another one very specifically about very famous women. Well, actually, some of them weren't famous, but we made them famous in our article. The women at war in 1776, the indispensable contributions of women. Often we hear about the men fighting the war. We never see what happened in the background. But back in those days, the men couldn't fight without the support of the women taking care of everything for them. They were the logistics, and you really need to listen to this one to find out how strong that really was. Then we have another one, 250 years, price stability, lost to slow inflation. And this talks about how prices were so stable for over 150 years. You could buy a plow and then 3 or 4 generations later pay the same price for it. That's how this country started. It's a fascinating dive into what's happened with our cost of living and that. So there are more to come. We have others also, and we have many articles already written on retirecoast.com. So thank you for coming to our podcast, and please return.